November 12th, 1982. The Great Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. In the deep old-growth forests of Appalachia, there are rules that the locals follow with religious fervor. You do not whistle in the woods at night. You do not answer if you hear your name called from the dark, and if you hear the sound of a woman screaming or a baby crying coming from the tree line, you do not go to help. You lock your doors, turn off the lights, and pray that the creature moves on. This is not superstition, it is survival. For centuries, the mountain people have whispered about a phantom. They call it the widow, a shadow that moves through the canopy, blacker than the night itself. It is not a spirit, it is a biological anomaly, a predator that has evolved the terrifying ability to mimic the sounds of its favorite prey. Before we enter the cabin where the Miller family spent their longest night, I need to know where you are watching from. Are you safe in the bright lights of London, Toronto, or perhaps Sydney? Tell me your city in the comments below. And I have a question that tests your humanity against your survival instinct. If you were alone in a snowstorm and heard a newborn baby crying just outside your porch, would you open the door or would you leave it there? Be honest. Your answer might determine if you survive this story. If you enjoy these deep dives into survival horror, please hit the like button and subscribe to Primal Fear. We explore the things that hunt us when we think we are safe. The existence of large black cats, melanistic panthers or cougars, in the eastern United States is officially denied by the authorities. The Department of Wildlife maintains that there are no breeding populations of jaguars or leopards in Tennessee. Yet every year, hundreds of credible witnesses report seeing a massive, sleek black animal moving through the ridges. They report finding tracks that are too large for a bobcat and too feline for a bear. But most chilling of all, they report the sounds, not a roar, but a high-pitched, oscillating scream that sounds exactly like a terrified woman. This phenomenon is known as aggressive mimicry, a hunting strategy where a predator imitates a distress signal to lure a concerned victim into an ambush. In 1982, the Miller family, John, his wife Sarah, and their two young children knew nothing of these legends. They were from the city, looking for a quiet weekend getaway. They rented a remote A-frame cabin at the end of a long gravel logging road, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but as they unpacked their car, the sky turned a slate gray, and the first heavy flakes of a blizzard began to fall. The snow wasn't just weather. It was a cage. It would bury the road, cut the phone lines, and trap them in a white silence. As the sun set behind the ridge, the forest changed. The birds stopped singing. The squirrels vanished. The family dog, a loyal German shepherd named Buster, refused to get out of the car. He whined, his hackles raised, staring fixedly at the roof of the cabin. John Miller thought the dog was just cold. He didn't realize that the dog possessed senses he lacked. The animal could smell the musk of a predator that had been marking this territory for years, and he could hear the heavy padded footsteps of something that was already positioned in the trees above the house, waiting for the lights to go out. The gravel road that led up to Black Mountain Ridge was not designed for the family station wagon. It was a logging trail, carved into the granite spine of the Great Smoky Mountains decades earlier, and then forgotten by the county. As John Miller wrestled the steering wheel, navigating the deep ruts and washouts, the dense canopy of the Appalachian forest closed in above them. It was late afternoon on Friday, November 12th, 1982. The sunlight was already dying, filtered through the gray clouds, and the thick pine needles casting the woods in a perpetual premature twilight. In the back seat, the two children, 8-year-old Emily and 10-year-old Mike, were asleep, lulled by the vibration of the car. Beside John, his wife Sarah stared out the window, watching the endless wall of trees blur past. She noticed how the forest seemed to change the higher they climbed. The colorful autumn maples gave way to dark, looming firs and spruces. The air grew colder. The radio signal, which had been playing a pop song from Knoxville, dissolved into static, and then silence. They were crossing a threshold. The cabin they had rented was described in the brochure as a secluded paradise. When they finally rounded the last bend and saw the structure, secluded felt like an understatement. The A-frame house sat in a small, natural clearing, surrounded on all sides by old-growth timber. It was built of dark, stained cedar, with a steep metal roof, designed to shed snow. A stone chimney climbed the side of the house like a spine. There were no other lights visible in the valley. No power lines stretched to the road. The cabin ran on a large propane tank and a diesel generator, housed in a shed around the back. It was off the grid. In 1982, this meant total isolation. No cell phones, no internet, just a landline telephone that connected to the main switchboard miles away in the valley below. John killed the engine. The silence that followed was instant and oppressive. There was no hum of traffic, no distant siren, just the ticking of the cooling engine block and the soft sigh of the wind in the upper branches. "We're here," John said, trying to sound cheerful. He opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit him immediately. It was a sharp, biting cold that smelled of impending snow and damp earth. He walked to the back of the wagon to let the dog out. Buster was a 90-pound German shepherd, a loyal and protective animal that usually bounded out of the car to mark his territory the moment they stopped. But today, Buster didn't move. When John opened the tailgate, the dog remained curled in the back corner, his ears flattened against his skull. He was trembling. A low, vibrating whine escaped his throat. "Come on, boy," John urged, whistling. "We're here. Go do your business." Buster looked at John, then looked past him, staring fixedly at the tree line to the north. His hackles, the fur along his spine, stood up in a rigid ridge. He bared his teeth, but not in a snarl of aggression. It was a grimace of fear. The dog refused to leave the car. John had to grab his collar and physically pull him out. As soon as his paws hit the gravel, Buster scrambled, keeping his body low to the ground, and pressed himself against John's legs, looking frantically at the dark woods. "He's just cold," Sarah said, shivering as she unpacked the grocery. "Get him inside." But John was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew dogs. This wasn't cold. This was instinct. Buster was reacting to a scent, or a sound that human senses were too dull to perceive. John scanned the clearing. Nothing moved. The forest was still, but it was a stillness that felt watched. He had the sudden, irrational sensation of being in a fishbowl, with something staring in from the outside. While Sarah and the kids unpacked, John decided to check the perimeter. It was a habit. He walked around the cabin, checking the propane tank and the generator. The ground was a mixture of frozen mud and patches of old snow. As he rounded the corner near the wood pile, he stopped. In the mud, near the foundation of the house, there were tracks. John knelt down to examine them. He expected to see the familiar print of a black bear, 5 toes, claw marks, a wide pad, or perhaps the erratic tracks of a raccoon. But what he saw confused him. The prints were massive, nearly 5 inches across. They were round, not oval. There were 4 toes, but crucially, there were no claw marks visible in the mud. Canines, dogs, wolves, coyotes cannot retract their claws. They always leave nail marks. Bears also leave distinct claw impressions. The only animal that leaves a large round print with no claws is a feline. "Bobcat," John whispered to himself. But a bobcat print is small, maybe 2 inches. This was the size of a saucer. It was heavy, sinking deep into the half-frozen mud. It suggested an animal that weighed close to 200 pounds. John stood up, looking at the roof. The tracks didn't lead away into the woods. They led to the house. They stopped right at the base of the trellis that ran up the side of the chimney. He looked up. The trellis was broken in places, The wood splintered as if something heavy had used it to climb. A mountain lion. Cougars were supposed to be extinct in the eastern United States. The official government line was that there hadn't been a breeding population in the Appalachians for 100 years. Yet the evidence in the mud told a different story. And if it was a cougar, it was a monster. John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He decided not to tell Sarah. She was already nervous about the isolation. He kicked some dirt over the tracks, erasing the evidence. Just a big dog, he told himself. Maybe a stray mastiff from a farm down the valley. He went back inside. The cabin was warming up. The fire was lit in the great stone hearth. The kids were choosing bunks in the loft. It felt cozy. It felt safe. The thick wooden door was shut and locked. The windows were double-paned. They were protected. But as evening settled in, the weather turned. The forecast had called for light flurries. But the mountains make their own weather. The wind picked up, whistling through the eaves of the house. The snow began to fall in earnest. Thick, heavy flakes that piled up quickly on the windshield of the car, and blanketed the clearing in white. By 7:00 p.m., the world outside was gone. The windows were black mirrors reflecting the interior of the cabin. Buster, the dog, would not settle. He paced the living room floor, his nails clicking nervously on the hardwood. He stopped at the door, sniffing the crack at the bottom. Then he would run to the window, stare into the blackness, and emit a low, deep growl. "What is wrong with him?" Sarah asked, annoyed. "He's making the kids nervous. He smells a raccoon or a possum." John lied. "He's a city dog. He's not used to the woods." But John kept his eye on the dog. Buster wasn't looking at the ground level. He kept looking up. He was staring at the ceiling, at the heavy timber rafters that supported the roof. He tracked something moving across the roof that the humans couldn't hear. His head moved slowly from left to right, following an invisible path. Creak. A sound from above. It was the sound of a heavy weight shifting on the shingle. "It's just the snow settling," John said loudly, trying to convince himself. "The heat from the chimney melts the snow and it slides. But snow doesn't possess rhythm." The sound above wasn't a slide. It was a step. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Something was walking on the roof. John stood up and went to the gun rack he had brought. He took down his 12-gauge Remington shotgun. He loaded shells into the tube, the metallic clack-clack sounding loud in the quiet room. "John?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "What are you doing?" "Just checking the generator." John's lights flickered. "I want to make sure the fuel line is clear before the snow gets too deep." He didn't go outside immediately. He turned on the porch light. He peered through the peephole. The snow was falling in a curtain of white, illuminated by the yellow bulb. He couldn't see the roof from here. He couldn't see the trees. He opened the door. The cold wind rushed in. Buster tried to bolt back into the bedroom, whining. John stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held across his chest. He walked to the edge of the railing and looked up at the roof line. The snow on the roof was disturbed. There were slide marks near the chimney, but the roof was empty. Whatever had been there had moved. John scanned the trees surrounding the cabin. The floodlight reached only about 20 feet before the darkness swallowed it. In that liminal space between the light and the dark, he saw nothing, but he felt it, the weight of eyes. Then he heard it. It came from the tree line to the west. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar. It was a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Ma. It was faint, carried on the wind. It sounded wet and choked. It sounded exactly like a newborn baby crying in the distance. John stood frozen on the porch. His brain tried to process the data. A baby, out here, in a blizzard? It was impossible. No human would be out there. It had to be an animal, a bobcat, a fox. But the cadence was too perfect. The rhythm of the breath, the hitch in the cry. It was unmistakably human. He took a step off the porch. The instinct to help, the biological imperative to save a child, was overwhelming. "Hello?" he shouted. "Is someone there?" The cry stopped instantly. Silence. Then from a different direction from the east, behind the house, the sound returned. "Ma. Help, Ma." John spun around. How could it move that fast? It had covered 50 yards in seconds, without making a sound in the brush. He realized then that he wasn't listening to a baby. He was listening to a lure. He backed up slowly onto the porch. He kept his gun raised. He retreated into the house and slammed the heavy door, throwing the deadbolt. His hands were shaking. "What was it?" Sarah asked,
seeing his nothing, John said, leaning against the door, listening to the wind, just the wind in the trees. But he knew. He looked at Buster, who was now hiding under the kitchen table, shivering. The dog knew too. They weren't alone on the mount, and whatever was out there knew how to sound like something harmless. Chapter 1 ends with the family locked inside the warm, bright cabin, while outside the snow covers the massive tracks that circle the house, and the widow settles into position on a branch, overlooking the power lines, waiting for the right moment to cut the lights. The illusion of safety in the modern world is maintained by a thin copper wire. Inside the cabin, with the curtains drawn and the electric baseboard heaters humming, the Miller family could almost pretend that the world outside didn't exist. The blizzard had intensified, burying the station wagon up to its axles in drifts, but inside the atmosphere was domestic and warm. Sarah was clearing the dinner plates. The children, Mike and Emily, were playing a board game on the rug in front of the fire. The horror of the baby cry from an hour earlier had receded slightly, pushed to the back of John's mind by the mundane comfort of light and heat. But the dog knew. Buster had not moved from his position under the table. He refused food. He refused water. His ears were swiveled backward, pressing against his skull, listening to the vibrations of the house. He wasn't tracking squirrels or raccoons. He was tracking a heavy weight that was moving methodically around the perimeter of the foundation. John stood by the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. He couldn't see anything but the swirling white wall of snow illuminated by the porch light. The visibility was zero. If something was standing 5 feet from the window, he wouldn't know it until it broke the glass. He checked his watch. He checked the shotgun, leaning against the wall. He felt foolish for being so armed in a vacation rental, but a primal alarm bell in his lizard brain was ringing incessantly. Something is wrong. We are not alone. Then, the lights flickered. It wasn't a standard brownout caused by the wind. The lights didn't just dim. They surged. The bulbs in the chandelier flared with a brilliant, blinding white intensity, humming loudly like angry hornets. The television in the corner popped and hissed static. Then dark, total, absolute blackness slammed into the room. The hum of the refrigerator died. The heaters clicked off. The only light remaining came from the dying embers in the fireplace and the faint gray luminescence of the snow outside filtering through the cracks. Dad, Emily's voice was small and trembling in the dark. I can't see. Stay put, John ordered, his voice tight. Nobody move. It's just a fuse. The storm probably knocked a branch onto the line. He fumbled in his pocket for his lighter. He struck the flint, the small flame illuminating his anxious face. Sarah, get the flashlights from the kitchen drawer. I'm going to check the breaker box. Don't go outside, Sarah whispered, grabbing his arm. Her grip was painful. John, please, don't go out there. I have to. John, if the generator stalled, the pipes will freeze by morning. We need heat. It'll take 2 minutes. He didn't mention the other reason. He didn't mention that generators don't just surge and die. He didn't mention that the power line ran along the side of the house, exactly where he had seen the massive tracks earlier. He grabbed the heavy maglite flashlight and his shotgun. He racked the slide, chambering a Ideally, he would have stayed inside, barricaded the door, and waited for dawn. But without heat in a blizzard, hypothermia was a certainty. He had to restore the power. John unlocked the deadbolt. The sound of the metal sliding back seemed deafening. He opened the heavy oak door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into the entryway. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind him to keep the heat in. He was now in the arena. The world was a chaotic swirl of white. The wind roared through the pines, creating a cacophony that masked all other sounds. John swept the beam of his flashlight across the clearing. The snow was piling up fast. The tracks he had seen earlier were gone, buried under 6 inches of fresh powder. The generator shed was located around the back of the cabin, about 20 yards away. John stepped off the porch, sinking to his shins. He moved slowly, sweeping the light left and right. Every shadow looked like a crouching beast. Every swaying branch looked like a claw. He reached the corner of the house. He shined the light up the wall, tracing the conduit pipe that carried the main power cable from the shed to the breaker panel. The conduit was bent. It was a heavy steel pipe, bolted to the log. It had been pulled away from the wall, the brackets ripped out of the wood. John followed the pipe down with his light. At the junction box, where the wires were exposed before entering the shed, the cable was severed. John knelt down, his heart hammering against his rib. He brushed the snow away from the wire. He expected to see a clean cut, perhaps caused by a falling sheet of ice, or a snap caused by tension. He didn't see a clean cut. He saw a mess. The heavy, insulated rubber coating of the 20-volt cable had been There were puncture marks, deep enough to reach the copper core. The wire hadn't snapped. It had been gnawed through and then ripped apart by brute force. John stared at the damage. The realization hit him with the force of a punch. This wasn't weather. An animal had done this. But what? Rats chew wires to nest. Squirrels chew wires by accident. This wire was thick as a thumb. To sever it required immense jaw strength. And the location of the cut was specific. It was the main feed. It cut the power. John whispered, the steam of his breath snatched away by the wind. It knows what the wire does. The predator hadn't just attacked the house. It had laid siege to it. It had removed their advantage. It had blinded them. Suddenly, John felt it. The sensation of being watched. It was a physical pressure on the back of his neck. The hair on his arms stood up under his heavy coat. The wind seemed to drop for a second, creating a pocket of silence in the storm. He spun around, aiming the flashlight and the shotgun at the roof of the shed. Nothing, just snow-covered shingles. He swept the light towards the tree line. The beam cut through the falling snow, illuminating the trunks of the ancient pines. Then he saw the eyes. They were high up, not on the ground. They were about 12 feet in the air, perched on the lowest branch of a massive spruce tree directly overlooking the shed. Two orbs of reflective green-gold light. They weren't blinking. They were locked onto him. John froze. The distance was less than 30 feet. The creature was right above him. In the halo of the flashlight beam, he couldn't see the body clearly. Just a massive, sleek black shape that absorbed the light. A shadow that had mass. But he saw the tail. It hung down from the branch, thick and long, twitching with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The panther let out a sound. It wasn't a roar. It was a low, vibrating purr that sounded like a heavy engine idling. It was a sound of pleasure. It was enjoying the fear. John didn't shoot. He knew that at this angle, with buckshot he might miss the vitals, and simply enraged. A wounded panther dropping from a tree onto his head would be the end. He backed away. Slowly, he kept the light in the animal's eyes, hoping to blind it. Go away, he shouted, his voice cracking. The panther didn't move. It simply watched him retreat. It knew he was going back to the bar. It knew he was trapped. It had all night. John reached the corner of the house. He turned and ran. He scrambled up the porch steps, slipping on the ice, skinning his shin. He threw himself at the door, fumbling for the hand. He burst into the cabin and slammed the door, locking the deadbolt, then the chain, then dragging a heavy chair in front of it. John, Sarah was standing by the fireplace with a candle. Did you fix it? John leaned against the door, gasping for air, his face pale as the snow melting on his jacket. He looked at his wife. He looked at his children huddled under blankets. He couldn't tell them the whole truth. Not yet. The generator is dead, John said, his voice trembling. The line is broken. We can't fix it. So we have no heat? Sarah asked, panic rising in her voice. We have the fire, John said. We stay by the fire. We keep it burning high. He walked to the window and nailed a blanket over it. Then he went to the other windows and did the same. He was blocking the view. He didn't want the creature looking in, but more importantly, he didn't want his children to see the green eyes that he knew were currently descending from the tree and moving towards the house. He sat down by the fire, the shotgun across his lap. He looked at Buster. The dog had moved. He was now positioned at the bottom of the chimney, staring up into the flue. What is it, boy? John whispered. A trickle of soot fell into the fireplace. Scritch, scritch. The sound of claws on stone, coming from the roof. The lights were out. The heat was dying, and the visitor was walking on the shingles, looking for a way down. The siege had moved from the perimeter to the structure itself. Channel engagement break. Before we continue to the next chapter of this nightmare, I want to take a moment to ask you something. We are building a community here at Primal Fear dedicated to the highest quality storytelling in the survival and horror genre. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the legend of the widow, please consider hitting the like button right now. It helps these stories reach more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have a new documentary dropping every week, and you don't want to be left in the dark when the next story begins. Now back to the cabin. The fireplace in the center of the Miller cabin was no longer a luxury. It was a life support system, with the electric heaters dead, and the blizzard howling through the cracks in the logs. The temperature inside the room had begun to plummet. John fed the fire with heavy oak logs, building a wall of heat against the encroaching cold. The family sat huddled on the rug, wrapped in quilt. The flickering orange light cast long, distorted shadows that danced on the walls, turning the mounted deer antlers above the mantel into grasping skeletal fingers. It was 10 Evans a.m. The house was silent save for the crackle of the wood and the wind outside, but it was a tense, brittle silence. Every member of the family was listening. They were waiting for the sound of the heavy paws on the roof to return, but the roof was quiet. The creature had stopped moving. Sarah was holding her daughter Emily, rocking her back and forth. "It's gone," she whispered, trying to convince herself. It tried the roof. It couldn't get in, so it left. Bears don't stay out in storms like this. John didn't correct her. He didn't tell her it wasn't a bear. He sat facing the door, the shotgun resting across his knees, his finger tracing the trigger guard. He watched Buster. The German Shepherd was not sleeping. He was sitting rigid by the door, his nose pressed against the jamb, inhaling deep, shuddering breaths. The dog wasn't growling anymore. He was whining, a high-pitched sound of distress that John had never heard him make before. Then the sound came. It didn't come from the roof. It came from the front porch, directly on the other side of the heavy oak door. Ma, ma. The sound pierced the cabin like an ice pick. It was loud, wet, and urgent. It was the unmistakable, heart-wrenching cry of a newborn infant in distress. It cycled rhythmically. Wah. Breath. Wah. Sarah froze. Her eyes went wide, dilating in the firelight. The maternal instinct is one of the most powerful biological forces in nature. It overrides logic. It overrides fear. When a mother hears a baby crying, her brain releases cortisol and adrenaline. She is hardwired to respond. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, pushing the quilt aside. "There's a baby out there. Someone left a baby on the porch." She stood up, moving toward the door. John leaped up. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "No," he hissed. "Don't touch the lock." "John, are you deaf?" Sarah screamed, hysteria rising in her throat. "Listen to it. It's freezing. It's going to die." "It's not a baby, Sarah," John said, gripping her shoulders hard enough to bruise. "Think, we are 5 miles up a logging road in a blizzard. There are no neighbors. No one walked up here carrying an infant just to leave it on our mat. Maybe they crashed," Sarah argued, struggling against him. "Maybe the parents crashed the car. And, let me go. Ma, help. Ma." The cry changed. It shifted pitch. It became raspier, deeper, and then it did something that made the hair on John's arm stand up. It stuttered. "Ma. Ah." It sounded like a recording skipping. It sounded mechanical. "Listen to the breath," John whispered, pulling Sarah back towards the fire. "Listen to the space between the cries. It's too regular. It's not breathing like a human." The sound outside stopped abruptly. For a long minute, there was only the wind. Sarah stood trembling, tears streaming down her face, torn between her husband's logic and the horror of the sound. Then a new voice spoke from the darkness. "Hello?" It was a woman's voice, high, thin, and terrified. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The voice was coming from the window John had covered with the blanket. It was muffled by the glass and the fabric, but it was clear. "Please," the voice said. "Let me in. It's cold." Sarah looked at John, her face pale as ash. "That's a woman, John. That is a human woman." John leveled the shotgun at the window. He was sweating, despite the cold. His mind was reeling. Could there be a woman out there? Was there a logical explanation? Maybe a hiker lost in the storm. If he didn't open the door, he was sentencing a human being to death. But if he did open— "What's your name?" John shouted at the window. Silence. Then the voice replied, "Hello? Is anyone there?" It was the exact same intonation, the exact same pitch. It wasn't an answer. It was a repetition. "It's mimicking," John realized, the horror washing over him. It heard a woman once, maybe a hiker it killed years ago, or maybe it's listening to us right now. "Let me in," the voice repeated, but this time the tone shifted. It dropped an octave. It became a guttural growl that morphed into words. "Let me in." The sounds of the phonetic structures were breaking down. The creature was struggling to maintain the illusion. The vocal cords of a panther are designed to roar, not to articulate consonants. The effort required to shape the sound into human speech was immense, and the mask was slipping. Sarah backed away from the window, her hand over her mouth. She finally understood. The thing outside wasn't asking for help. It was fishing. The voice moved. It didn't walk away. It circled the house. They could hear the heavy crunch of snow as the predator moved from the window to the back door. It was testing every entrance, using the sound as a key, trying to find a psychological crack in the armor of the prey. Buster, the German Shepherd, could take it no more. The dog had been bred to protect. The intrusion of this unnatural sound into his territory triggered a switch in his brain. He stopped whining. He started to bark a deep, ferocious, aggressive bark. He threw himself at the back door, scratching at the wood, snarling at the thing on the other side. Buster. No, Mike, the 10-year-old boy yelled, but the dog was in a frenzy. He wanted to get at the threat. Outside, the creature went silent. It was listening to it was assessing the new variable. Then it made a new sound. Woof, woof. It barked back. It wasn't a perfect bark. It sounded like a cough, wet and deep, but it was close enough. It was mocking the dog. It was a challenge. John realized the danger too late. The dog wasn't just barking at the door. He was barking at the latch. In his frenzy, Buster was jumping up, his paws hitting the lever-style handle of the back door. It was an old iron latch, designed to be easy to open. Grab the dog, John shouted, diving across the room. But Buster hit the latch. The metal clicked. The wind outside caught the door. The heavy oak door swung open. The blizzard rushed into the kitchen, blowing snow across the floor. The candle on the table was extinguished instantly. For a second, there was nothing but the swirling white darkness of the storm. Then Buster charged. He launched himself out into the night, barking furiously, a missile of fur and teeth engaging the enemy. Buster, John screamed, reaching the doorway. He saw the dog hit the snow. He saw Buster run towards the edge of the light, towards the wood pile, and then he saw the shadow. It rose from the snow behind the wood pile. It was huge, sleek, black and liquid. It moved with a speed that the human eye couldn't track. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like a patch of darkness that had detached itself from the night. Buster didn't even have time to yelp. The panther struck him with a single paw swipe. The blow caught the 90-pound dog midair. It was like watching a train hit a deep. Buster was knocked sideways, tumbling into the deep drift. The panther pounced. It landed on the dog. There was a brief, violent flurry of snow, a single sharp snap of bone, and then silence. The barking stopped. John stood in the open doorway, the shotgun raised to his shoulder. He aimed at the darkness. "Hey!" he screamed. "Get away!" He fired. Boom! The flash lit up the clearing. The buckshot tore into the wood pile, sending splinters flying. But there was nothing there. The space where the dog and the panther had been was empty. There was only a disturbed patch of snow and a drag mark leading into the trees. The creature had taken the dog. It hadn't eaten him there. It had carried him away.
John grabbed the door handle and slammed it shut, throwing the bolt and dragging the heavy kitchen table in front of it. He stood there, chest heaving, listening. From the dark woods, the sound returned. It wasn't a baby crying. It wasn't a woman screaming. It was the sound of a dog whimpering. Whine. Whine. It was Buster's voice, but it was wrong. It was looping. It was the creature, mimicking the last sounds the dog had made, trying to draw the master out to save his pet. John slid down to the floor, his back against the barricade. He looked at his family. They were huddled by the fire, eyes wide, traumatized. They realized now that they were not fighting an animal. They were fighting something that understood love, loyalty, and fear, and used them all as weapons. The mimicking stopped. The creature realized the tricks wouldn't work anymore. The door was locked. The bait was taken. Now it would have to find another way in. John looked up at the ceiling, the heavy timber beams, the chimney. "Put more wood on the fire," John whispered, his voice dead. "Build it high. Build it until it roars." "Why?" Sarah asked, clutching her children. "Because," John said, looking at the large, dark opening of the fireplace, "that's the only hole in the house we can't lock." Chapter 3 ends with the flames rising in the hearth, illuminating the soot-stained bricks of the chimney, while outside, the heavy padded footsteps of the widow begin to climb the trellis towards the roof again. The psychological game was over. The physical siege was about to begin. The fireplace in the Miller cabin, was a grand rustic structure made of rough-hewn river stones, cemented together with mortar. It was the centerpiece of the living room, designed to be the heart of the home. But as midnight approached on November 12th, the chimney had transformed from a source of comfort into a tunnel of vulnerability. It was a direct, vertical shaft, connecting the sanctuary of the living room to the roof, where the widow was now pacing. John Miller stood before the hearth, his face illuminated by the roaring flames. He was feeding the fire with a manic intensity, throwing log after log onto the grate, until the firebox was a churning inferno of orange and yellow. He wasn't trying to warm the room. He was trying to create a thermal barrier. He knew that most animals fear fire, but he also knew that this particular animal possessed a problem-solving intelligence that bordered on the unnatural. Above them the sounds were distinct and heavy. Thump, creak, thump. It was the sound of weight shifting on the asphalt shingles. The roof of the A-frame was steep, designed to shed snow, but the creature moved with a terrifying, sticky grace. It wasn't sliding, it was gripping. The claws that had left no marks in the mud were now digging into the roof decking, finding purchase on the frozen surface. Sarah sat on the floor, her back against the sofa, holding Mike and Emma. She had covered their ears with her hands, pressing their heads into her chest so they wouldn't hear the footsteps. But she could hear them. Every creak of the rafters sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her veins. She looked at the ceiling, tracing the path of the beast with her eye. It was moving from the eaves towards the peak, towards the chimney stack. "It's checking the cap," John whispered, stepping back from the fire, raising the shotgun. "It's looking down." A shower of soot and creosote crumbled from the inside of the flue, landing with a soft hiss in the fire. Then, a draft of cold air rushed down, swirling the smoke back into the room. The creature was blocking the airflow. It was looking down the throat of the house. John imagined the view from above. The creature perched on the chimney pot, staring down into the column of rising smoke, its green eyes reflecting the glow of the embers. He wondered if it could feel the heat. He wondered if it cared. Then, a sound echoed down the chimney. It wasn't a roar, it was a sniff, a deep, wet inhalation, amplified by the acoustics of the stone shaft. It sounded like a massive bellows drawing air. The creature was smelling them. It was smelling the fear, the sweat, and the wood smoke. "Get back," John ordered, motioning his family away from the hearth. "Move to the kitchen wall." He racked the slide of the Remington. Clack, clack. The sound was crisp and violent. He aimed the barrel up into the dark maw of the chimney. He knew he couldn't shoot. If he fired a slug up the flue, the recoil and the debris could collapse the masonry, or the ricochet could kill them all. But he wanted the creature to know he was waiting, as if sensing the weapon, or perhaps driven back by the intense heat of the oak fire. The presence at the top of the chimney withdrew. The draft returned to normal. The smoke was sucked up again, but the siege didn't end. It shifted. The footsteps moved. They left the chimney and traversed the ridgeline of the roof. They moved towards the front of the house, towards the large, triangular window that formed the apex of the A-frame. This window looked into the loft where the children's beds were. "The loft," John said, his blood running cold. "It's going for the loft." The cabin had a second floor, a sleeping loft, accessed by a wooden ladder. It was currently dark and empty, but the window up there was just a single pane of glass. It was the weakest point in the structure. John scrambled up the ladder, his flashlight clamped in his teeth, the shotgun in one hand. He reached the loft level. The air up there was colder. He shined the light at the triangular window. For a moment, he saw nothing but the reflection of the room and the swirling snow outside. Then, a black shape blotted out the snow. The widow was hanging upside down from the roof peak, peering into the room. Its face was pressed against the glass. In the beam of the flashlight, John saw the monster clearly for the first time. It was a melanistic cougar, but the proportions were nightmare fuel. The head was massive, scarred and broad. The ears were tattered. The eyes were a milky cataract-clouded green, yet they focused with laser precision. The lips were pulled back,
revealing teeth that were yellowed and long. It didn't look like an animal. It looked like a gargoyle that had peeled itself off a cathedral to feed. The creature tapped on the glass. Tap, tap. It used a single claw. It wasn't trying to break it immediately. It was testing the resonance. It was checking the thickness. John shouted, a guttural roar of defiance, and charged the window, slamming the butt of his shotgun against the wall to make noise. Get out of here. The panther didn't flinch. It watched him with a detached, scientific curiosity. It saw the gun, it saw the man, and then, it made a decision. It reared back, and struck the glass. Smash. The sound of shattering glass was explosive. Shards rained down onto the empty beds. The cold wind of the blizzard rushed into the loft, extinguishing John's flashlight. He was in the dark with it. He fired. Boom. The muzzle flash illuminated the loft. For a split second, the slug blew a hole through the window frame, sending wood splinters into the night. But the creature was gone. It had anticipated the shot. It had dropped from the roof to the porch roof below, out of the line of fire. John. Sarah screamed from downstairs. John, I missed. John yelled, racking another shell. It's on the porch roof. It's trying to flank us. He backed down the ladder, his heart hammering so hard his vision blurred. The integrity of the cabin was compromised. The loft was open to the elements. The creature could enter at will now. It had high ground. They retreated to the center of the living room. The house, which had felt like a fortress hours ago, now felt like a cage made of matchsticks. The wind howled through the broken upper window, carrying snow down into the living area. The temperature was dropping fast. We can't stay here, John said, looking at the ceiling. It's inside. It's in the structure. They could hear it moving in the loft. The heavy thud of paws on the floorboards above their heads. Dust drifted down from the ceiling plank. The creature was walking directly over them. It was pacing. It was looking for the hatch, the opening to the ladder. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife. She stood in front of the children, pointing the blade at the ceiling. Where do we go? She sobbed. There's nowhere to go. The basement, John said. The cabin had a root cellar. It was an unfinished basement, dug into the earth, with walls of cinder block and a floor of poured concrete. The entrance was a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, usually covered by a... It was cold, damp, and dark, but it had one advantage. It had no windows. It was a bunker. Move, John ordered. Quietly, they moved to the kitchen. John kicked the rug aside and hauled up the heavy wooden trapdoor. A smell of damp earth and mold wafted up. It looked like a black mouth, waiting to swallow them. Go, John whispered, down the stairs. Don't use the light. Sarah herded Mike and Emily down the steep wooden steps. They vanished into the gloom. John waited at the top, his gun trained on the living room. He heard the sound of claws on the ladder. The creature was coming down from the loft. John saw a shadow detach itself from the darkness of the ceiling. It landed on the living room floor, with a soft, heavy thud. It was inside the main room. The firelight caught the sleek black fur. The muscle rippled under the skin as it prowled towards them. It moved with a liquid silence that was mesmerizing and terrifying. It lowered its head, sniffing the air. It smelled the open trapdoor. John didn't wait. He didn't try to negotiate. He aimed at the mass of shadows and fired his second shot. Boom. The shot tore up the floorboards in front of the panther. The creature hissed, a sound like high-pressure steam, and leaped sideways, vanishing into the kitchen shadows. John jumped down the trapdoor. He reached up and slammed the heavy wooden lid shut. He threw the slide bolt, locking it from the inside. They were sealed in. The basement was pitch black. John fumbled for the flashlight, but he didn't turn it on immediately. He listened. Above them, the house belonged to the widow. They heard the creature walk across the kitchen floor. The footsteps were heavy, distinct. It stopped directly above the trapdoor. It sniffed the cracks. Then, it began to scratch. Scritch, scritch. It wasn't the frantic scratching of a dog. It was slow, deliberate. It was testing the wood. It was peeling away splinters. Then the sounds changed. They heard the creature moving furniture. A chair was knocked over. Glass shattered. The refrigerator was bumped. It was tearing the house apart. It was searching for another way down. It was venting its frustration on their possession. But the most terrifying sound came 10 minutes later. From the floor above, muffled by the wood, came a voice. John. It was Sarah's voice. Perfect. Identical. John. Open the door. In the basement, darkness, the real Sarah clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. The children buried their faces in her coat. The creature had heard them talking. It had recorded the tone, the pitch, the intimacy, and now it was using the wife's voice to try and trick the husband into opening the gate. John, please, it's cold. John sat on the bottom step of the basement stairs, the shotgun pointed at the ceiling. He cried silently, tears tracking through the soot on his face. He knew it wasn't his wife. His wife was holding his hand, but the sound was so real, so human, that it made his mind reel. It was a violation of nature. It was a biological tape recorder, playing back their own love to use as a lure. The voice continued for an hour. Sometimes it was Sarah, sometimes it was the baby crying, sometimes it was just a low, oscillating hum that vibrated in their They sat in the dark, shivering, waiting for the wood of the trapdoor to fail. They were buried alive in the foundation of the house, while above them, a monster wore their voices like a skin. Chapter 4 ends in the total darkness of the cellar, with the camera focusing on the dust falling from the ceiling planks, as the creature paces back and forth, waiting for them to make a mistake. Time behaves differently in the dark. Down in the root cellar, beneath the floorboards of the besieged cabin, minutes stretched into hours, and hours felt like geologic epochs. The air in the basement was damp and heavy, smelling of raw earth, sprouting potatoes, and the sharp, acidic tang of human sweat. The only heat came from the 4 bodies huddled together on the concrete floor, wrapped in a single dusty moving blanket John had found in a corner. They were shivering, not just from the encroaching frost that was seeping through the cinder blocks, but from a bone-deep shock that numbed the mind. Above them, the cabin had become a theater of violence. For the first few hours, the sounds were constant. The widow was not merely inhabiting the space, she was dismantling. They heard the heavy crash of the bookshelf overturning, the shattering of the china cabinet, and the ripping sound of upholstery being shredded by claws that acted like razors. It wasn't a frenzied search for food. It sounded like a tantrum, a deliberate, systematic destruction of the human environment. The creature was marking its territory by erasing theirs. But the worst sounds were the quiet ones. Interspersed with the violence were long periods of silence, broken only by the mimic. The creature had stopped using Sarah's voice. It seemed to realize that the trick had failed. Instead, it returned to the sound that had first lured John to the door. Ma. Ma. The cry of the baby echoed through the floorboards, muffled but audible. In the pitch black of the cellar, the sound was hallucinogenic. It floated in the air, a ghost frequency designed to trigger a biological response. Sarah covered her ears, rocking back and forth, humming a tuneless melody to drown it out. John gripped the shotgun so hard his hands cramped, pointing the barrel relentlessly at the wooden trapdoor above their heads. He knew that the only thing separating them from the monster was 2 inches of pine planking and a rusty slide bolt. If the Panther wanted to get in, really wanted to, it could dig through the floor, but it didn't dig. It paced. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps moved in a circle around the trapdoor. It knew they were there. It could smell them through the cracks. It was sitting on top of the hatch. Wait. It was a siege of patience. The predator was banking on the fact that humans are weak, that they need heat, water, and light. It was waiting for them to make a mistake. Around 3 a.m., the temperature in the basement dropped below freeze. The breath of the children misted in the beam of the flashlight that John flicked on for a split second every 10 minutes to check the bolt. The cold was becoming a new enemy. Hypothermia was setting. John knew that if they stayed down there much longer, they wouldn't die of teeth. They would simply go to sleep and never wake up. Then the pacing stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. There were no more cries, no more crashing furniture, just the wind howling outside, muffled by the earth. John waited. He counted to 60, then to 600. Is it gone? Mike whispered, his voice a dry rasp. Shh, John hissed. It might be listening. They waited for another hour. The silence stretched until it became physically painful. Had the creature left, or was it lying in ambush, perfectly still, right next to the trapdoor? Panthers are ambush predators. They can remain motionless for hours, but as the time ticked, Towards dawn, the biological imperatives of the animal kingdom offered a glimmer of hope. Large predators are often crepuscular or nocturnal. As the sun approached, they typically retreated to dense cover to sleep. If the widow was following the laws of nature, laws she had bent but not broken, she would retreat with the light. At 6:30 a.m., grey light began to filter through the cracks in the floorboards above. It wasn't sunlight, but the diffuse, pale illumination of a snowy dawn. "We have to move," John whispered. "We're freezing to death down here." He stood up, his joints popped. He climbed the wooden stairs to the trapdoor. He placed his hand on the wood. It was cold. He listened. Nothing. He slid the bolt back. It made a loud clack. He paused, waiting for a reaction from above. Silence. He pushed up. The door was heavy, possibly weighed down by debris. He shoved hard. The door gave way, lifting an overturned chair with it. John peeked over the rim, the shotgun barrel leading the way. The living room was destroyed. It looked as if a bomb had gone off. The sofa was gutted, stuffing scattered like snow. The curtains were torn down. The air smelled of musk, a pungent, wild cat scent that watered the eyes, mixed with the smell of wood smoke and cold ash. "Clear," John whispered. "Come up, quickly." He pulled Sarah and the kids up from the dark hole. They stood in the ruin of their vacation home, blinking in the morning light. The front door was wide open, hanging off one hinge, swaying gently in the wind. Snow had drifted into the living room, covering the floor in a white blanket. And in the snow, inside the house, were the huge, round pug marks. They were everywhere. On the rug, on the kitchen counter, on the dining table. The creature hadn't just walked. It had claimed every inch of the space. It had walked on the furniture to keep its paws off the cold floor. "Get to the car," John ordered. "Don't stop for anything. Just get to the car." They moved towards the door, stepping over the debris. They stepped out onto the porch. The world outside was a blinding white void. The blizzard had dumped 2 feet of snow overnight. The trees were heavy with it, bending under the weight. The silence of the mountains was profound. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine frozen landscape. John scanned the tree line. The sun was trying to break through the clouds. Visibility was good. There was no sign of the black shadow. They trudged through the deep snow towards the station wagon. The car was a white mound, buried up to the windows. "I'll clear the exhaust," John said, handing the shotgun to Sarah. "You watch the trees. If you see anything black, you shoot. You don't ask questions." John dug frantically at the snow around the tailpipe. He cleared the driver's door. He jumped in and turned the key. Roar. The engine turned over sluggishly. The cold had thickened the oil and drained the battery. "Come on," John pleaded. "Come on." Roar. The V8 engine roared to life. A plume of grey smoke shot out of the back. The heater blasted cold air, but it was running. "Get in," John shouted. Sarah and the kids piled into the car. The doors slammed shut. The locks clicked down. For the first time in 12 hours, they felt a barrier between them and the wild. But as John put the car in gear, preparing to rock it out of the snowdrift, Sarah screamed, "John, look." She was pointing out the passenger window towards the roof of the cabin. John leaned over. He looked. Hanging from the edge of the roof, swaying slightly in the wind, was a red object. It was Buster's collar. The leather was chewed and torn, but the dog was gone. And then John saw the rest of the mess. On the pristine white snow of the roof, written in red, was a trail of drag marks, leading to the chimney. The creature hadn't just killed the dog. It had hauled the 90-pound animal up to the roof. It had eaten its meal directly above their heads, while they cowered in the basement. The realization made John retch. The thumping sounds they had heard, the scratching. It wasn't just the creature pacing, it was the creature feeding. He didn't wait to see more. He slammed his foot on the gas. The station wagon spun its tires, whining against the ice, then caught traction. The car lurched forward, fishtailing down the unplowed driveway. They drove down the mountain, sliding around corners, bouncing over hidden rocks. They didn't speak. They just stared out the windows at the passing trees, expecting at any moment to see a black blur racing alongside the car. They didn't see the widow again, but as they descended into the valley, where the snow turned to rain, and the first telephone poles of civilization appeared, John noticed something on the hood of the car. There were scratches in the paint, deep, parallel gouges in the metal. Sometime during the night, before they had gone to the basement, or perhaps just before dawn, the creature had been on the car. It had sat on the hood, watching the house. It had owned their escape route too. It could have smashed the windshield. It could have waited inside the car. but it did. It let them leave. Why? Because the game was over. The intruders were leaving. The territory was secure. They reached the county road. They saw a truck driving the other way. They saw a gas station. They stopped, weeping, safe in the mundane world of asphalt and gasoline. But they knew that they had left a piece of themselves up on that ridge. They had left their innocence. The Miller family survived, but they brought back a story that the Rangers didn't want to hear. A story that proved that in the deep hollows of Appalachia, the apex predator isn't a bear, and it isn't a man. It is a voice in the dark that sounds like your own family calling for help. Chapter 5 ends with the car driving away, fading into the distance, while the camera pulls back to the cabin. The door is open, the snow is falling inside, and from the darkness of the tree line, a single high-pitched cry begins to echo through the valley. Ma. The sun that rose over the Great Smoky Mountains on November 13, 1982, was brilliant and deceivingly warm. It began to melt the heavy snowpack, turning the pristine white landscape into a slush of grey mud and dripping pines. Down in the valley town of Gatlinburg, the world was normal. Tourists were buying pancakes, locals were opening their shops, but in the sheriff's station, the atmosphere was chaotic. John and Sarah Miller sat on a wooden bench, wrapped in police-issue wool blankets. They were catatonic. They had told their story 3 times, first to the gas station attendant, then to a deputy, and finally to the sheriff himself. The story didn't change, but the reaction of the authorities did. It shifted from concern to skepticism, and then to a polite, condescending dismissal. A bear, Mr. Miller, the sheriff repeated, tapping his pen on the desk. You saw a black bear. They get aggressive this time of year. They break into cabins all the time. It wasn't a bear, John said, his voice flat. Bears don't cut power lines. Bears don't sound like babe. The sheriff exchanged a look with his deputy. Stress does funny things to the ears, son. And the wind in these hollers, it can sound like anything you're afraid of. They weren't listening. They couldn't listen. To admit that a large predatory cat, a species officially extinct in the eastern United States for 100 years, was hunting people would be a disaster. It would panic the tourists. It would close the park. Politics demanded a but there was one man in the room who wasn't looking at the politics. Ranger Thomas Holloway was a 20-year veteran of the National Park Service. He had spent more nights in the woods than in his own bed. He stood in the corner, leaning against the filing cabinet, watching the family. He saw the scratches on the car hood. He saw the terror in the children's eyes. He knew that bears were brute force instruments. They smashed, they didn't siege, and they certainly didn't mimic. I'll go up, Holloway said, grabbing his keys. I'll do the site assessment. Take a rifle, Tom, the sheriff said. Ideally, find me a bear track, so we can close this. Holloway drove his jeep up the logging road. The snow was melting fast, washing away the evidence. The road was treacherous, slick with mud. As he climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the silence of the deep woods returned. He reached the cabin at noon. The scene was a study in violence. The front door was hanging off its hinges. The snow on the porch was trampled into a slurry of mud and wood splinters. The generator shed door was ripped open. Holloway started his investigation not at the house, but at the perimeter. He walked the tree line. The melting snow made tracking difficult, but Holloway was an expert. He found what he was looking for in a patch of shade, where the snow was still hard. A single perfect print. It was round. It was 4-toed, and it had no claw marks. Holloway measured it, 4.5 inches wide. He placed his own hand next to it. The paw was bigger. Cat, he whispered. Big cat. He moved to the generator shed. He inspected the conduit pipe. It had been pulled from the wall with tremendous force. He examined the severed wire. He took out a magnifying glass. The copper strands weren't snapped. They were sheared. There were teeth marks on the insulation. Deep, triangular punctures. But it was the precision that bothered him. The animal had bitten the wire exactly where it entered the box. It had identified the source of the energy. Intelligence, Holloway noted in his logbook. Targeted sabotage. He moved to the cabin. He entered the living room. It was a wreck. Furniture destroyed. Upholstery shredded. But Holloway noticed the pattern. The destruction wasn't random. The creature had specifically targeted obstacles. It had moved the heavy oak table that John had used to barricade the door. It had tried to dig through the floorboards above the basement. Then he went to the roof. He used the ladder John had left out. He climbed onto the porch roof, and then shimmied up to the main A-frame peak. The snow here was stained pink. He found the collar, Buster's leather collar, chewed and frozen. Beside it were the drag marks, where the dog had been pulled up. but it was what he found caught in the shingles that stopped his breath. A tuft of fur. It was caught on a nail head. Holloway pulled it free and held it up to the sunlight. It wasn't the coarse, shaggy brown fur of a bear. It was short, dense, and jet black. It shimmered with an iridescent sheen. Melanistic, puma, concolor, Holloway murmured. The ghost. He knew the legends. He knew the old-timers talked about the widow. He had always dismissed them as moonshine stories, but here was the physical proof. A genetic anomaly. A black cougar. Perhaps a remnant population that had survived in the deepest ravines, evolving in isolation, or perhaps something that had escaped from a private zoo and adapted to the cold. Holloway bagged the fur. He climbed down. He decided to track the exit trail. The drag marks from the roof led to the back of the house, then into the deep woods. The creature had carried the dog away. Holloway followed the trail for a mile. The terrain got steeper, descending into a rocky gorge known as Devil's Trap. The vegetation was thick, laurel hells that tore at his uniform. The smell of the den hit him before he saw it. It was a musky, ammonia-heavy stench of urine and rotting meat. He found the dining table. It was a flat rock, outcropping sheltered by a massive overhang. The remains of the dog were there, but there were other things too. Holloway saw deer antlers. He saw the skull of a raccoon, and in the corner, pushed into a crevice, he saw a pile of collars. There were 5 or 6 of them, nylon collars, leather collars with tags. These were hunting dogs, pets that had gone missing over the last few years. The creature had been hunting the hunters. It had been taking the guardians first. Holloway backed away. He unslung his rifle, the safety clicking off. He felt the eyes. He looked up at the ridge above the deck. There, sitting on a limestone ledge, watching him, was the widow. She was magnificent and terrifying. She lay low against the rock, her black coat blending perfectly with the shadows. Only her eyes were visible, green gold lamps burning in the gloom. She didn't growl. She didn't she simply watched him with a calm, arrogant possession. She knew he saw the collars. She knew he knew. Holloway raised his rifle. He had a clear shot. He could end the legend right now. He could prove the Millers right. But he hesitated. If he shot her, he would have to haul the body out. He would have to present it to the sheriff. The press would descend. The scientists would come. They would dissect her. They would open the park to a frenzy of monster hunters. The mystery would be sterilized under fluorescent lights. And there was something else, a primal respect. She hadn't attacked him. She had let him see. Holloway lowered the rifle. He backed away, keeping his eyes on the
Stay deep, he whispered to the beast. Stay away from the houses. He retreated down the mountain, leaving the queen on her throne. When Holloway returned to the station, the sheriff was waiting with the report form. Well, the sheriff asked, did you find the bear? Holloway reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed the plastic bag containing the black fur. He thought about the Millers. He thought about the wire cut with surgical precision. He thought about the baby's cry. Yeah, Holloway said, his voice heavy. It was a bear, a big male. Rogue. I tracked him over the ridge. He's moved on into the deep backcountry. He won't bother them again. The sheriff nodded, relieved. Good. Write it up. Bear encounter. Structural damage due to intrusion. Let's get the insurance paperwork started. Holloway sat at his desk and wrote the lie. He filed the official report that turned a monster into a nuisance. He burned the black fur in the ashtray. The Miller family never returned to the Smokies. They moved to the coast, as far away from the tree line as they could get. They told their story to friends, but eventually they stopped. No one believed the part about the mimicry. It was too impossible. But the locals knew. The story of the siege spread through the mountain towns. They knew why Holloway had come back pale. They knew why he started patrolling that specific sector more often, always stopping his truck to listen to the wind. The widow was still out there. She had learned a new lesson. She learned that if she let the humans leave, they wouldn't come back with the army. She learned discretion. The attacks didn't stop, but they changed. Hikers would go missing in the fog. Solo campers would vanish, their campsites left intact, their food untouched. The authorities called it exposure or falls, but the bodies were rarely found, and on quiet winter nights, when the snow muffled the world, The people living on the edge of the park would sometimes hear it. Not a roar, not a scream, but the faint, distant sound of a baby crying in the dark, hungry and cold, waiting for a door to open. Chapter 6 ends with Holloway sitting in his patrol truck, years later, gray-haired, watching the tree line as the sun sets. He rolls up his window, locks the door, and drives away, leaving the mountains to the darkness. The legend of the widow persists in the folklore of the Great Smoky Mountains, not because of the physical violence, but because of the psychological violation. We are accustomed to predators that roar, growl, or stalk. We understand the language of aggression, but a predator that uses our own social instincts against us, that cries like a baby to weaponize our compassion, or speaks with the voice of a loved one to bypass our locks, terrifies us on a primal level. Biologists call this aggressive mimicry. It exists in nature. The alligator-snapping turtle uses a tongue that looks like a worm to lure fish. The margay cat in the Amazon has been recorded mimicking the cry of baby monkeys to draw the mothers into rain. It is not scientifically impossible for a large feline, isolated for generations in the deep hollows of Appalachia, to adapt its vocalizations to the most abundant prey source available: humans. The story of the Miller family serves as a grim parable for our modern isolation. We go to the wilderness to disconnect, to find peace. We believe that our technology, our electric lights and our locked doors separate us from the food chain. But the widow proved that these barriers are fragile. A wire can be cut, a generator can be destroyed, and when the lights go out, the rules of civilization end, and the rules of the jungle begin. Ranger Holloway's decision to burn the fur and file a false report is a common trope in these legends, but it speaks to a deeper truth. Perhaps there are things in the woods that we are not meant to catalogue. Perhaps some mysteries are better left as rumors, warnings to keep us vigilant. If the official report admitted that a melanistic panther with human-level problem-solving skills was hunting in the park would close, the illusion of control would shatter. By calling it a bear, Holloway maintained the order of things. He allowed the public to sleep at night. But for those who have heard the cry in the dark, the sleep never comes easily again. The phenomenon of the black shuck, the wampus cat, or the widow suggests that the eastern cougar never truly went extinct. It just evolved. It became smarter. It became quieter. And it learned that the best way to survive in a world dominated by humans is to sound exactly like them. So the next time you are in a cabin deep in the woods, and the wind picks up and the power flickers, listen. If you hear a branch snap, it's probably a deer. If you hear a howl, it's probably a coyote. But if you hear a voice calling your name from the tree line, or the soft, wet cry of an infant where no infant should be, do not open the door. Do not be a hero. Lock the deadbolt, stoke the fire, and wait for the sun, because the thing on the porch isn't asking for help. It is asking for dinner. This brings our investigation into the legend of the widow to a close. But now I want to hear from you. Do you believe that animals can learn to mimic human sounds to hunt? Have you ever heard something in the woods that sounded wrong? Or was this just a case of hysteria and a very smart bear? Let me know your theory in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story of psychological horror, siege, and the uncanny valley kept you on the edge of your seat, you have found your tribe. Primal Fear is dedicated to the stories that make you check the locks twice. If you thought the intelligence of the widow was terrifying, you need to see our documentary on the Sankabetsu brown bear incident. This isn't a legend. It is a historically documented fact. In 1915, a massive bear named Kesagaki didn't just attack hikers. He waged war on a village. He broke into houses. He hunted families in the dark. And in the most horrifying twist of all, he returned to the funeral of his first victim to finish the meal. It is the ultimate story of home invasion by a monster. Click the video on your screen right now to see how a village in Japan was wiped off the map by a single animal. The Sankabetsu nightmare is waiting for you. Until then, stay out of the dark, and don't trust the voice.